A soft hum calls from the volcano's heart, a melody only one young woman can hear. Lyra is a Valyrian dragonkeeper, and this mysterious sound pulls at her very soul. She knows ignoring her duties to follow it could cost her everything, yet she cannot resist the promise of a secret lost to time. By the end of this tale, you will uncover the legendary treasure she finds and feel the peace of a world where magic still sleeps. What ancient power hums so gently, waiting for a single listener, and what forgotten wonders lie hidden in the dark? I would love to know, as we begin, where you are listening from and what the hour is where you are. What is one mystery you feel is still waiting to be found? Her fingers brushed against a smooth, warm surface hidden within the volcanic rock. It was a shard of obsidian, darker than the deepest night, and it pulsed with a soft, internal light that matched the rhythm of the hum. Ancient runes, carved with impossible precision, swirled across its surface. A compulsion she could not name guided her hand to press her palm flat against the stone. The moment her skin made contact, the runes flared with a gentle, golden radiance. A vision, sharp and breathtaking, flooded her mind. It was not a memory, but a glimpse of something lost. She saw a single dragon egg, its shell a mosaic of emerald and bronze, resting in a nest of cooled magma. It was perfect, whole, and waiting. Then the image was gone, leaving behind a profound sense of purpose that tightened her chest. Her duty was to the hatchery, to the predictable routines of feeding and cleaning. But this was a call to something far greater. The risk of discovery, of being branded a traitor to her house for abandoning her post, suddenly felt small against the weight of that beautiful, fleeting image. She made her choice. With a quick, furtive movement, she tucked the warm obsidian into a fold of her tunic, hiding its light. She would finish her shift. She would tend to the hatchlings, and then, under the cover of night, she would begin her search. As she walked back toward the familiar heat of the hatchery, the low hum stayed with her, a quiet and constant companion, promising that her world was about to change forever. The library's air was thick with the scent of crumbling parchment and old stone. Lyra's official task was to reshelve scrolls on dragon husbandry, but her true purpose hummed against her chest, where the obsidian shard lay hidden. In a secluded corner, shielded by towering shelves, she carefully unrolled a fragile scroll. Its brittle edges flaked like ash in her hands. The text spoke of a lost lineage, dragons of emerald and bronze, whose line was thought severed generations ago. Her heart quickened as her fingers traced a fragmented diagram tucked within the scroll's final fold. It was a map, its lines faded, but its intent clear, pointing toward a place called the Whispering Spire. This was no ordinary peak. The map depicted it as an unstable finger of rock deep within the volcano's core, a place where the earth itself was known to groan and shift. The path to it was a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels, marked with warnings of sudden tremors and collapsing chambers. Just as she committed the key landmarks to memory, a shadow fell over the parchment. The head archivist, a man with eyes as sharp as his quill, looked down at her. "Your interest in these old lineages is unusual for a dragonkeeper," he noted, his voice deceptively mild. Lyra's blood ran cold. She forced a calm she did not feel, explaining she was cross-referencing feeding patterns from a century past for the new hatchlings. For a long, silent moment, he simply watched her, and she felt the weight of his suspicion like a physical pressure. The moment he turned away, the decision was made. She could not risk leaving this evidence behind. With hands that trembled only slightly, she smoothed a blank piece of scrap vellum and began to copy the essential fragments of the map. Every scratch of her charcoal felt dangerously loud in the silent hall. She marked the treacherous route, the unstable geology of the spire, and the small, distinct chamber where the diagrams suggested something precious was sealed away. Slipping the copy into her sleeve, she returned the original scroll with forced nonchalance. The physical danger of the spire was now a terrifying reality, but the memory of that emerald and bronze egg burning in her mind made the risk a necessary one. With the copied map a secret weight against her skin, she left the library, her thoughts already turning to the dark, waiting tunnels. The volcanic rock groaned under Lyra's weight, a constant reminder of the mountain's unstable nature. She moved upward through the steep lava tube, her fingers probing each potential handhold with a dragonkeeper's practiced care. Her knowledge of geology was her only guide, testing the integrity of the stone before trusting it with her life. A misstep here would not be a simple fall. It would be a disappearance, her fate sealed in a forgotten crevice. The air grew thick and warm, pressing in on her from all sides, and a familiar, cold dread began to coil in her stomach. The fear of being trapped, of the endless tons of rock above her, threatened to paralyze her. She forced herself to stop, pressing her back against the warm stone wall. She closed her eyes and drew a long, slow breath, just as her old mentor had taught her during the first terrifying days in the hatchery tunnels. Breathe in the earth's fire, he would say, and breathe out your own fear. You are part of this mountain, not its prisoner. The technique was a frail shield against the crushing darkness, but it was enough. She opened her eyes, her resolve hardened. She pushed off from the wall, reaching for a jutting ledge above her. The moment her hand closed around it, the entire section of rock gave way with a sickening crack. A cascade of stones and dust tumbled down, a small but furious rockslide that slammed into her legs and back. Panic surged, pure and blinding. For a heart-stopping second, she felt the mountain itself was trying to swallow her. Instinct took over. She scrambled, clawing at the stable rock beside her, hauling herself upward and out of the slide's path just as it settled, blocking the tunnel below her with a final, dusty sigh. She lay panting on a narrow ledge, her heart hammering against her ribs, the taste of stone dust sharp on her tongue. The path back was gone. There was only forward now. The near disaster had stripped away any lingering illusion of a simple adventure. This quest was lethally real. As her breathing slowly calmed, a soft, new light began to bleed into the darkness ahead. She crawled forward, and the cramped tunnel opened abruptly into a vast, breathtaking cavern. The ceiling soared high above, and the entire chamber was illuminated by a gentle, eerie glow. Countless fungi, clinging to the walls and floor, pulsed with a soft blue and green bioluminescence, casting shifting shadows and revealing a subterranean world of quiet, impossible beauty. The cavern breathed with a soft, living light. All around her, great fans of fungi glowed with a cool blue-green luminescence, casting a dreamlike sheen on delicate, heat-resistant ferns that unfurled from cracks in the stone. This was a secret garden, a pocket of impossible life, thriving in the volcano's heart. The air was still and strangely warm, filled with the faint, earthy scent of growth. As Lyra moved deeper into the chamber, her boot brushed against something metallic. She knelt, pushing aside a curtain of glowing moss to find a discarded tool half buried in the soft, volcanic soil. It was a dragonkeeper's grooming pick, its handle intricately carved with the now familiar emblem of the emerald and bronze lineage. The metal was tarnished with great age, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. A cold dread trickled down her spine, mingling with the wonder of the place. She was not the first to answer the call. Someone else had stood here, perhaps centuries ago, drawn by the same hum, seeking the same lost treasure. The question hung in the silent air, heavy and terrifying. Had they succeeded, or had this beautiful garden been the last thing they ever saw? The stakes of her own mission suddenly felt immense, tied to a thread of history that had been severed long before she was born. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the pick. It felt like a message, a warning, and a key all at once. Trusting an instinct deeper than fear, she tucked it securely into her belt. It was a link to that forgotten keeper, a sign that she was walking a path others had dared to tread. As she stood, a gentle, warm draft brushed against her cheek, carrying with it the faint, persistent melody of the hum. It was stronger here, clearer, pulling her toward a narrow archway on the far side of the cavern. The path was not yet over. The garden was not the destination, but a waypoint on a journey into a deeper mystery, leading her ever closer to the whispering spire and the promise it held. The narrow archway opened not into another tunnel, but onto a breathtaking and terrifying void. Lyra stood at the edge of a chasm, so vast she could not see the bottom, only a deep, swirling darkness that seemed to breathe cold air upward. Spanning the abyss was a bridge of pure, crystalline rock, so slender it looked like a thread of spun glass. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, catching the faint light from the fungal cavern behind her and scattering it into 1,000 tiny, shimmering rainbows. As a gust of warm air moved through the chasm, the bridge itself emitted a soft, melodic hum, a crystalline song that vibrated through the soles of her boots. She needed to test it. Leaning forward carefully, she tapped the edge of the crystalline path with the toe of her boot. A sharp crack echoed in the immense space, and a small shard, no larger than her thumb, broke free from the main structure. It tumbled into the darkness below, disappearing without a sound. Her heart seized. The bridge was far more fragile than it appeared, a beautiful, singing death trap. To turn back was impossible. The tunnel behind her was sealed. The only way was across. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get the crossing over with quickly, but she knew that haste would be her end. She made a conscious, difficult choice, forcing her body into a state of deliberate calm. She would move with the slow, measured patience of a dragonkeeper, tending a newly hatched worm, where a single sudden move could mean disaster. Placing her hands lightly against the cool, smooth crystal on either side for balance, she stepped onto the bridge. It vibrated faintly beneath her, its song shifting in pitch with her weight. She did not look down. Her entire world narrowed to the next 6 inches of crystalline path. She focused on the feeling of the rock beneath her feet, on the careful transfer of her weight from her back foot to her front, on the steady, controlled rhythm of her breathing. One slow, deliberate step, then another. The immense drop yawned below her, a silent promise of oblivion. The air grew colder the further she ventured, and the humming of the bridge seemed to grow louder, a constant reminder of its delicate nature. Time stretched and bent around her. It felt like an eternity, this dance with gravity, each step a victory against the fear tightening her chest. Then, her forward foot found solid, unyielding rock. She took one last, final step, pulling her whole body onto the firm ledge of the far side. A shuddering breath escaped her, a breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. The relief was so profound, her knees felt weak. Ahead, the hum that had guided her this far was now a clear, resonant call, emanating from a dark, arched entrance, carved directly into the chasm wall. The bridge was behind her, its trial past, but the source of the song was finally within reach. The stone archway felt like a membrane of pure energy, cool and yielding against her skin as she stepped through. The moment she crossed its threshold, the ambient humming that had filled her ears for days suddenly coalesced, solidifying into a soft, intelligible whisper that seemed to emanate from the very air around her. "Welcome, child of the stone," it breathed, the words not heard with her ears but felt within her mind, a sound like shifting sand, an ancient wind. A shiver that was not born of cold ran the length of her spine. The tunnel ahead split into two identical, dark passages. As she hesitated, the whisper returned, a gentle pressure guiding her attention toward the left-hand fork. "This way lies the spire," it murmured. "The other path leads only to a slow sleep in the dark." Trust felt like a luxury she could not afford in this deadly place. Every lesson from her life as a dragonkeeper screamed at her to rely on her own senses, her own map, her own hard-won judgment. To follow a disembodied voice felt like madness, a surrender of her will to the very forces that had consumed the keeper whose tool she now carried. Yet the whisper held no malice, only a profound and weary patience. It felt less like a command and more like an answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. Her own intuition, that deep and wordless knowing, did not rebel against it, but instead seemed to settle to calm. She made her choice. With a final glance at the right-hand tunnel, she turned left, committing her fate to the guidance of the unseen. It was a leap of faith, unlike any she had ever taken, adding a layer of mystical risk to the already very real danger of collapsing stone. The act of trusting felt like stepping onto the crystalline bridge all over again, a deliberate surrender to a force she did not fully understand. The chosen path immediately began to slope upwards, the grade gentle but steady. The air grew warmer, carrying with it the sharp, tangy scent of sulfur and the clean, electric smell of a storm, the unmistakable aroma of ozone. The very stone began to burn. A deep, radiating heat pulsed from the tunnel walls, seeping through the soles of her boots and pressing against her skin like a physical weight. Lyra fumbled in her pack, her fingers clumsy, and pulled out a scrap of cloth and her dwindling water skin. She dampened the fabric, the water hissing softly as it met the scorching air, and pressed it to her forehead and the back of her neck. The relief was immediate but fleeting, the dampness evaporating in moments. Every step forward was a battle of will against the oppressive energy of the mountain, her muscles aching and her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her body screamed for her to stop, to retreat, but the whisper in her mind was a steady, cooling thread, urging her onward. Finally, her legs buckled. She slid down the wall into a crouch, forcing herself to take small, measured sips of tepid water. To drink too much now would be a disaster, leaving her with nothing for the return journey, a thought as chilling as the heat was sweltering. This was no longer just a search for a relic. It was a primal contest between her own fragile endurance and the unforgiving heart of the volcano. Dehydration clawed at her throat, and a dizzying exhaustion threatened to pull her into a deep and dangerous sleep right there on the burning floor. She closed her eyes, focusing on the memory of the emerald egg, using its image as an anchor against the tide of fatigue. After a few precious minutes, she pushed herself back to her feet, her body protesting every movement. Wrapping the now dry cloth around her hand to shield her palm, she pressed forward, one heavy foot in front of the other, and then she saw it, a faint red glow painting the tunnel ahead, a promise of an end to this fiery passage. The red glow resolved into the mouth of a vast, circular chamber, but it was not fire that illuminated the space. It was a soft, spectral shimmer emanating from the very walls. They were encrusted with enormous, fossilized dragon scales, each one larger than her entire body. They curved and overlapped in a silent, petrified tide, their surfaces a mosaic of deep obsidian, bronze now turned to stone, and a startling, fossilized emerald that still seemed to hold a flicker of inner light. The air was still and cool, heavy with the profound silence of an ended age. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She approached slowly, as one would approach a sleeping god, and reached out a trembling hand to lay her palm flat against one of the great emerald scales. The stone was cool and smooth, but the moment her skin made contact, a jolt of pure feeling surged up her arm. It was not a vision this time, but an emotion, a vast, timeless sense of majesty, of soaring on impossible winds, and of a deep, resonant connection to the living heart of the world. This was not just a relic, it was a memory made solid, a direct link to the creatures that were the soul of her people. The weight of it was immense. Her quest was no longer just about answering a mysterious hum or finding a lost treasure for herself. It was about the entire, glorious and tragic history of Valyria. She was a single thread in a tapestry woven by these magnificent beings, and the duty to honor that legacy settled upon her shoulders like a physical mantle. She sank to her knees, bowing her head before the wall of scales. It was a small, instinctive gesture, a dragonkeeper's ritual of respect for the departed. She whispered a few words of the old tongue, a prayer for peaceful slumber she had only ever spoken over hatchlings that did not survive their first hours. Here, in this hall of ancient giants, the words felt both terribly small and profoundly right. The act did not lessen the weight of her responsibility, but it transformed it. The fear and exhaustion were still there, but they were now joined by a fierce, unshakable resolve. She was not merely an intruder in these deep places, she was an inheritor. As she rose, a gentle, cool draft brushed against her cheek, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of high, thin air. It flowed from a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the far wall, a dark crack that promised a way upward, toward the source of the hum and the waiting spire. The fissure was a tight, vertical crack in the stone, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through sideways. For a few terrifying moments, she was completely enclosed, the cold, rough rock pressing against her chest and back. Then, with a final push, she emerged into a new tunnel, and the air itself seemed to turn against her. A sharp, acrid stench filled her lungs, the unmistakable smell of sulfur so potent it burned her throat and made her eyes water instantly. A low, menacing hiss echoed from up ahead. She pulled the neck of her tunic up over her nose and mouth, but the coarse fabric did little to filter the poisonous air. Each breath was a struggle, a shallow gasp that offered little relief and left her chest aching. Her progress slowed to a pained crawl as the toxic fumes clouded her vision and clawed at her senses. She knew she could not stay here long. Her training screamed at her about the dangers of these volcanic gases, how they could steal consciousness in minutes and stop a heart soon after. A direct path forward seemed to lead directly into the source of the hissing, a shimmering, yellow-tinged vent in the floor. To rush through it would be a gamble with her life. Her head swimming, she forced herself to look for another way. Her eyes, stinging and blurred, caught a narrow ledge running along the wall to her left, high above the main floor. It was a treacherous path, requiring her to cling to small, sharp outcroppings with her fingertips, but it offered a chance to circumvent the worst of the fumes. The choice was clear, a lesson from the crystalline bridge applied once more. Speed would kill her. Deliberate, careful movement was her only chance. She chose the longer, more difficult route, a decision for survival over haste. Her muscles screamed as she pulled herself onto the ledge, her lungs burning for clean air. She inched along, her focus narrowed to the next handhold, the next foothold, each movement a small victory against the suffocating atmosphere. The hissing of the vent began to fade behind her, the air gradually losing its painful bite. After what felt like an age, the ledge widened and met the main tunnel again, safely past the toxic zone. She stumbled forward a few more steps, pulling the cloth from her face and drawing in deep, ragged breaths of the cleaner, cooler air. As her vision cleared, she looked up, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. A majestic staircase spiraled upward into the darkness, each step worn smooth by untold ages. It was a sight of both immense beauty and profound purpose, a path made by hands long turned to dust, leading her ever closer to the Spire's secret heart. The worn steps felt alive beneath her feet. Each one was carved with intricate glyphs, the ancient Valyrian script so faded it was more a suggestion in the stone than a clear message. As she ascended the spiraling stair, a soft murmur rose to meet her, the sound seeming to vibrate from the carvings themselves. At first it was a gentle cacophony of half-heard syllables, but the higher she climbed, the more the whispers began to weave together, forming a single, coherent thought that echoed in the silent chamber. Guard what is lost, for the world is not yet ready to remember. The words were not a welcome, but a solemn charge. A prickle ran across her skin, a distinct and unsettling sensation of being observed by something ancient and unseen. Yet, strangely, the feeling was not one of threat, but of vigilance, as if the mountain itself was a silent sentinel standing watch with her. She forced her breathing to remain steady, matching it to the rhythm of her steps. The climb was already a physical trial, her legs burning and her lungs straining in the thin air. Now she had to grapple with this cryptic message, to hold its meaning in her mind without letting it shatter her concentration. What was lost that needed such guarding, and who, or what, was the world that must be kept in ignorance? She repeated the phrase silently, committing its cadence and weight to memory. This was not a command to turn back. It was a key, a vital piece of understanding for whatever lay ahead. The explicit warning confirmed that her goal was protected by more than just crumbling rock and toxic gas. A powerful, ancient will was at work here, a magic that was aware of her presence and had deemed it necessary to speak. The stakes of her quest were no longer just personal. They were woven into the fabric of a much larger, hidden history. With renewed resolve, she took the final step, emerging onto a small, flat landing. Before her stood a grand, sealed door, immense and imposing. It was forged from a strange, dark metal and intricately inlaid with countless shards of dragon glass, which caught the faint light and glittered like a field of frozen stars. The dragon glass door offered no handle, no lock, only a single, smooth depression at its center, shaped like the slitted eye of a dragon. Lyra ran her fingers over the cool, dark metal, feeling the perfect contours of the indentation. It was a lock that demanded a key of a very specific shape. Her mind flashed back to the garden cavern, to the cold, tarnished grooming pick she had tucked into her belt. Its handle was carved with the emblem of the lost lineage, with hands that trembled only slightly from exhaustion and anticipation. She pulled the ancient tool free. The fit was perfect. She pressed the carved handle into the dragon's eye depression. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a deep, resonant click echoed through the stone landing, a sound of finality that seemed to shake the very mountain. With a groan of stone on metal that had not been heard in centuries, the immense door began to grind inward, revealing a sliver of profound darkness. This was it. There would be no easy retreat. The door would likely seal behind her, and the treacherous path back offered no guarantee of survival. She stood at the true point of no return, her old life as a keeper of routine, a fading memory on the other side of that threshold. She closed her eyes, drawing one last, steadying breath of the air from the world she knew, and then she stepped forward into the unknown. The moment she crossed the seal, the great door began its slow, grinding journey closed, cutting off the light and the sound from behind her with a definitive thud that echoed in the new silence. She was now utterly isolated, fully committed to the path she had chosen. The air inside was remarkably still and cool, carrying a faint, clean scent like rain-washed stone. And there, in the center of the round chamber, the source of the humming glow was finally visible, a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. The chamber was a perfect sphere of polished obsidian, its walls reflecting the room's only source of light. Suspended in the very center, with no visible means of support, was a crystal of impossible size. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, and from it emanated the beautiful, resonant hum that had called to her across leagues of stone. This was the heart of the whispering spire, the source of the song. Her eyes, however, were drawn downward, resting on a pedestal of what appeared to be fused volcanic rock. Directly beneath the floating crystal was the dragon egg. It was exactly as her vision had shown, a perfect sphere of emerald and bronze, its shell shimmering with a latent, captured heat that made the air around it waver. A profound, aching hope blossomed in her chest, and she took an eager step forward. Instantly, an invisible wall of force slammed into her, halting her progress and pressing her back. It was not a violent shove, but an immense, unyielding pressure, like trying to walk into a gale force wind. The air crackled with ancient power, a final, magical test guarding its charge. This was not a barrier meant to be broken with strength. but with worth. She closed her eyes, shutting out the mesmerizing sight of the egg. She focused inward, on the memory of the fossilized scales and the majestic sorrow they had imparted. She thought of her life in the hatchery, of the countless hours spent tending to the needs of other dragons, her hands gentle on their warm hides. She poured every ounce of her pure intent into her mind, her reason for being here. It was not for glory or for power, but for the simple, profound duty to preserve a life that should not have been lost. She focused on her connection to dragonkind, a bond that was the very foundation of her existence. She took another step, pushing not with her body, but with her spirit. The barrier resisted, a tangible weight against her soul. Her muscles trembled with the strain, and a fine sweat broke out on her brow. This was the true trial, a judgment of her heart. With a final, silent plea, she took one more step. The pressure vanished so suddenly, she nearly stumbled forward. The air stilled, the crackle of energy gone. She had passed. She stood before the pedestal, her breath catching in her throat. The egg was so close she could feel the gentle warmth radiating from its shell. She could see the intricate, swirling patterns of emerald and bronze, patterns unique to this lost lineage. Her hand rose, almost of its own accord, her fingers reaching out, trembling, toward the ancient, slumbering life within the stone. Her fingertips met the warm, textured shell, and the world dissolved into light. A vision, more real than memory, seized her. She was soaring over jagged peaks, the wind a cool rush against emerald scales, her powerful wings beating with a rhythm that echoed the heart of the world itself. She felt the fierce intelligence, the deep loyalty, the ancient soul waiting within the stone. It was a dragon of the lost lineage, and in that single, breathtaking moment, it knew her. A bond snapped into place, silent and irrevocable, a thread of pure consciousness, connecting her to the slumbering life beneath her hands. She was no longer just its finder. She was its keeper, chosen and recognized. The weight of that responsibility settled upon her, heavier and more precious than the egg itself. She now possessed a key to a lost world, a treasure that houses would wage war to control. Any whisper of its existence would draw enemies from the shadows, men who would see the dragon not as a living being to be honored, but as a weapon to be wielded. There was only one choice. She had to get it to the one place she knew offered a semblance of safety, the main hatchery, where it could be hidden among the others until it was strong enough to face the world. Cradling the warm, pulsing egg carefully against her chest, she turned to begin the long journey back, but the mountain had other plans. A deep, grinding groan shuddered through the chamber, and the floor trembled violently beneath her feet. The crystal above flickered, its hum turning into a dissonant shriek. Her taking of the egg had disturbed a balance maintained for centuries, and the ancient spire, its purpose fulfilled, was beginning to come apart. The chamber convulsed with the mountain's rage. A thunderous crack split the air as a web of fractures raced across the obsidian walls, and the floor heaved, throwing Lyra against the pedestal. She curled her body protectively around the egg, the warm shell a stark contrast to the cold dread flooding her veins. A deafening roar filled the air as a massive section of the ceiling gave way, crashing down in a cloud of pulverized rock and dust. When the tumult subsided, a solid wall of rubble stood where the great door had been, sealing her tomb. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to choke her. to have come so far, to have touched a miracle, only to be crushed in the dark. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the air already thickening with dust. She could not die here. The legacy she carried was too important. Forcing her trembling limbs to move, she set the egg down carefully and scrambled to her feet, her dragonkeeper's instincts taking over. She ran her hands over the shuddering walls, her fingers reading the stone like a map, searching for a weakness, a seam, anything the Valyrian builders might have left. Her eyes, stinging from the dust, scanned the domed ceiling. There, high up, almost invisible in the chaotic play of shadows from the flickering crystal, was a perfectly circular dark patch. An air shaft. It was a feature of all the great Valyrian structures, a vent to manage the intense geothermal pressures. It looked impossibly narrow, a vertical tunnel of sheer, smooth rock. The climb would be a nightmare, a test of pure strength and will with no room for error, but the groaning mountain offered no other choice. It was a treacherous hope, or a promise of a swift end. With the egg cradled against her, she tore a strip from her tunic, fashioning a rough sling to bind the precious weight securely to her chest. The air shaft was a vertical tunnel of sheer, unforgiving rock. She could feel the mountain trembling around her, a deep, angry vibration that promised a swift and final collapse. Placing her hands and feet on the rough-hewn sides, she began to climb. The first dislodged stones clattered past her, a warning of the instability she was ascending into. Then a wave of blistering heat surged from below, carrying the smell of molten rock. Magma was rising, its orange glow beginning to paint the shaft walls beneath her feet. She had to move faster. Her muscles screamed in protest, her breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. She fumbled for the ancient grooming pick at her belt, jamming its sturdy metal tip into a thin crack in the rock. It held a tiny, desperate anchor that allowed her to find a higher foothold. This was no longer a climb of skill, but of pure, raw instinct. Every movement was a calculation between speed and safety, between her own survival and the fragile life pressed against her heart. A sudden, violent tremor shook the shaft, and a rain of fist-sized rocks tumbled down. She flattened herself against the wall, turning her body to shield the egg, feeling the impacts against her back and shoulders. The heat was becoming unbearable, searing the air in her lungs. She could hear the magma now, a low, gurgling roar that echoed up the narrow tube. Her world narrowed to the next handhold, the next desperate pull upward. Her fingers were raw, her arms shaking with exhaustion, but the thought of that emerald and bronze soul kept her moving. Just as the heat threatened to cook the air from her lungs, her scrabbling hand found not rock, but open space. She hauled her body upward, collapsing onto a solid, flat ledge. Cool, fresh night air washed over her, a shocking, blissful relief. She lay there for a long moment, gasping, her body trembling with spent adrenaline, the egg still warm and secure against her. She was out of the spire, but the faint, ominous red glow on the horizon and the distant rumble under her feet were stark reminders that her flight was far from over. The cold stone of the ledge bit into her back, a stark reminder of her exposure to the vast, open sky. Below her stretched a brutal landscape of sharp ridges and deep shadows, and across that impossible distance, the familiar, warm glow of the main hatchery beckoned like a cruel joke. It was a world away. Every muscle in her body felt like frayed rope, screaming in protest at the very idea of movement. A wave of pure despair washed over her, colder than the mountain wind. How could she possibly cross that? How could she protect the precious life in her care from the jagged rocks and the long, final drop? Her head fell back against the rock, and for a single, terrifying moment, she considered the quiet surrender of just closing her eyes. Then, a gentle, persistent warmth pulsed against her chest, right through the rough fabric of the sling. It was the egg. Its quiet, living heat was an anchor in the storm of her fear, a tangible reminder of the bond she had felt in the Spire. This was not just a burden she carried, it was a promise. She would not give up. She could not. Gritting her teeth, she forced her trembling body to sit up, her arms instinctively cradling the sling. Her physical and mental endurance were being tested to their absolute breaking point, but the egg's warmth became a focal point, a source of strength she drew upon with every ragged breath. She had to find a way down. Pushing the fatigue aside, she began to scan the treacherous descent with a dragonkeeper's analytical eye, searching for any weakness in the cliff face. And then she saw it, a subtle, narrow trail etched into the mountainside, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was a path worn not by human feet, but by the sure-footed passage of wild goats, weaving a more gradual, safer route down the otherwise sheer rock. The narrow goat trail was a treacherous lifeline etched into the cliff face. Each step sent small cascades of loose scree skittering into the abyss below, the sound a stark reminder of the long, silent drop that waited for a single misstep. Lyra moved with a painstaking slowness that defied the panic thrumming in her veins, her entire being focused on the transfer of weight from one foot to the other. Her arms and legs, already pushed far past their limits in the Spire, burned with a deep, trembling fatigue. The added weight of the egg secured against her chest altered her center of gravity, making every shift in balance a delicate calculation. She could not afford to rush. A fall here would not just mean her end, but the obliteration of the legacy she carried. The conflict was a constant, grinding pressure in her mind, the need for speed warring with the absolute requirement for caution. She made a conscious decision, a strategy born of sheer necessity. She would take short, frequent breaks, pausing every 10 or 12 steps to lean against the solid rock of the mountain, close her eyes, and take 3 deep, steadying breaths. These moments were not for rest, but for resetting her concentration, for reaffirming her grip on the present moment and the precious warmth against her heart. The real danger was a silent companion on the descent, the sheer drop, a yawning presence just beyond the edge of her vision. One loose stone, one moment of dizziness, and it would all be over. But the path, ever so gradually, began to change. The terrifying narrowness slowly gave way to a wider, more forgiving track. The steep cliff face softened into a slope, and the trail finally deposited her into a sheltered grove of twisted, ancient trees at the very base of the mountain. The quiet grove felt like a sanctuary after the mountain's fury. A small, clear spring bubbled up from between the roots of an ancient tree, and Lyra knelt before it, drinking until her parched throat was soothed and the dizzying exhaustion began to recede. The water was cold and pure, a simple, profound blessing. She then carefully unwrapped the egg, her movements reverent. Using a handful of soft moss from the spring's edge, she dampened it and gently wiped the warm, textured shell, cooling it just enough to mimic the conditions of a natural nest. As she did, The egg pulsed once, a slow, contented rhythm that vibrated softly against her palms. The connection between them felt stronger here, a silent conversation of need and care. This small act of tending restored a part of her spirit that the climb had shattered. For a few precious moments, there was only the whisper of leaves and the steady, living warmth in her hands. But the peace was fragile. She was still deep in the wilds, far from the safety of the hatchery walls. Her mind, clearer now, began to map the final, most dangerous leg of the journey. The main paths were wide and well-traveled, patrolled by other keepers and guards loyal to the great houses. To be seen now, with her prize, would be to lose everything. She chose a different way, a little-known route that traced the edge of a deep ravine. It was longer and more treacherous, but it offered the cover of thick, thorny brush and the shadows of the high cliff face. The risk of a misstep was high, but the risk of discovery was now even higher. Out in the open, she would be exposed, a single figure carrying a secret that could reshape the future. With the egg secured once more against her chest, she stood. Her body still ached, but her resolve was a tempered blade. The lights of the hatchery twinkled in the distance, a constellation of hope and peril. Under the deepening veil of night, she stepped out from the grove's protection and into the open, her path set toward those distant, glowing points. Every shadow became a temporary sanctuary, every rock formation a shield. Lyra moved with the silence of a hunting cat, her knowledge of the volcanic foothills her only true ally. She knew which paths were too exposed, which gullies echoed sound, and where the patrols were most likely to cross. Her progress was a slow, deliberate dance with the darkness, a constant calculation of risk and concealment. The crunch of a boot on gravel, startlingly close, froze the blood in her veins. A patrol. She threw herself sideways, pressing her body flat against a rough rock wall. Her breathing stopped. The egg felt like a beacon of warmth against her chest. A secret she was certain was visible in the dark. Two guards passed so near she could smell the leather of their armor. Their conversation, a casual murmur about the night's chill. She did not dare to exhale until the sound of their footsteps had faded completely, her heart a frantic drum against the stone. In that moment, the entire world felt amplified, the rustle of a single leaf sounding like a thunderclap, her own pulse a roar in her ears. The direct route was now compromised. With a grimace of resignation, she changed her plan. She turned away from the main track, descending into the deep, winding channel of a dry riverbed. It was a longer journey, adding precious time to her already exhausted state, but the steep, eroded banks offered deep shadows and total concealment from anyone on the higher ground. Speed was a luxury she could no longer afford. Stealth was an absolute necessity. The thought of capture was a cold knot in her stomach. It would mean more than just a reprimand. It would mean the egg, this living piece of lost history, confiscated and likely handed over to the political machinations of the great houses. For her, the punishment for such a reckless, unsanctioned quest would be severe, possibly exile from the only home she had ever known. The stakes were no longer just about success or failure, but about the complete and utter loss of everything she held dear. Finally, the familiar, towering walls of the main hatchery came into view, their warm, fire-lit glow a sight that should have meant safety. But the main gate was a hub of activity, crowded with guards and dragon keepers changing shifts. It was an impossible entrance. She could not simply walk through with her secret. She would have to find another, forgotten way inside. The memory surfaced like a clear dream. Years ago, as a young apprentice chasing a stray hatchling, she had discovered a hidden fissure behind a thick curtain of vines near the hatchery's great foundation stones. It was an old drainage tunnel, a forgotten channel for monsoon runoff, narrow and perpetually damp. It was her only chance. Pushing the heavy vines aside, she was met with the smell of wet stone and deep, undisturbed earth. The opening was a tight, dark mouth, barely wider than her shoulders. She had to turn sideways, pressing the egg protectively against her chest with one arm, while using the other to feel her way forward into the absolute blackness. Icy water dripped from the low ceiling, tracing cold lines down her back and splattering in the thick mud underfoot. Every sense was heightened, the squelch of her boots and the patter of droplets, unbearably loud in the confined space. The walls seemed to press inward, the weight of the entire hatchery above her feeling immense and suffocating. This was the final test of her nerve, a cruel gauntlet of claustrophobia after all she had endured. What if the tunnel had collapsed somewhere in the middle? What if she became stuck, trapped in the dark and the damp with her miracle, unable to move forward or back? The fear was a cold hand closing around her throat. She pushed it down, focusing on the mental map from her childhood, trusting the memory of that curious, winding path. She inched forward, her breath shallow, her entire world reduced to the next few inches of tunnel and the fragile warmth she shielded from the dripping water. To fail here, at the very threshold of safety, would make the entire epic journey a meaningless exercise in futility. The Spire's trials, the chasm's terror, the mountain's wrath, all of it would be for nothing if she could not take this final, muddy step. Her fingers, scrabbling ahead in the dark, suddenly met cold, rusted iron. It was a heavy grate, its bars crusted with age but still solid. Peering through the cross-hatched metal, she could make out the dim, familiar shapes of the lowest incubation chamber, a place of quiet shadows and stored supplies, empty and silent at this late hour. The familiar, warm humidity of the hatchery washed over her, thick with the scents of sulfur, warm stone, and the musky fragrance of living dragons. It was a perfume of home, a profound and dizzying relief that made her knees feel weak for a moment. She was back in a world of ordered routines and predictable dangers, a world of fire and life she understood, but she carried a secret that could shatter that order completely. Her mind raced, weighing the consequences of immediate revelation. To present the egg now would bring glory, yes, but also a storm of questions, of political maneuvering from the great houses who would each want to claim the lost lineage as their own. The egg would become a prize, a symbol, before it even had a chance to be a living creature. She could not allow that. The memory of the Spire's whisper, its charge to guard what was lost, solidified her decision. She would wait. She moved with a deliberate calm through the shadowy incubation chambers, her eyes scanning the rows of dragon eggs resting in their warm stone niches. She needed a place that was secluded, yet warm enough to sustain the life within the shell. Near the back of the chamber, where the thermal vents were less consistent and the light was dim, she found a deep, empty niche partially obscured by a natural stone column. It was perfect. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she carefully cleared away the loose ash and smoothed the warm gravel at the bottom of the niche. Then, with the reverence of a priestess performing a sacred rite, she lifted the emerald and bronze egg from its sling and settled it into the prepared hollow. She spent a few careful moments arranging a handful of common, dull-colored stones around its base, a simple but effective camouflage that would make it blend in with the dozens of other, less remarkable eggs. This was a delicate, risky operation performed in plain sight, her every sense attuned to the sound of approaching footsteps. One curious glance from another keeper, one moment of bad luck, and her entire journey would unravel. As she placed the final stone, her palm resting lightly on the warm shell, she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible pulse vibrated against her skin, a tiny, rhythmic thrum that was entirely new. It was not the slow, dormant warmth of before. It was the first, quiet sign of the life stirring within. The familiar rhythm of the hatchery was a soothing balm after her ordeal. Days had settled into a comforting pattern of feeding the hatchlings and tending the warm stone niches, a routine that allowed Lyra to watch over her secret with a quiet, constant vigilance. Then, one afternoon, as she gently turned the other eggs, a new sound cut through the soft hiss of the thermal vents. It was a faint, sharp tapping, like a tiny pebble being struck against the inside of a stone cup. Her breath caught, her eyes snapped to the camouflaged niche, and there it was, a single hairline fracture, tracing a delicate path across the emerald and bronze shell. A jolt of pure, unadulterated awe shot through her. The egg was not merely viable, it was alive, and it was fighting its way into the world. Her entire impossible journey, every moment of terror and exhaustion, crystallized into this one tiny, perfect sound. The success was overwhelming, but it was instantly followed by a cold wash of practical fear. This hatching could not be her private miracle. A dragon's birth, especially one from a lineage thought extinct for centuries, would bring every senior keeper and lord in the vicinity running. They would investigate everything, the egg's origin, how it came to be here. If they suspected she had smuggled it in, the consequences would be severe. She had to stage its discovery perfectly. Her movements became a study in controlled nonchalance. She continued her work, slowly making her way down the row of niches until she reached the one that held her future. With the practiced air of a keeper, simply optimizing conditions, she subtly rearranged the heat stones surrounding the egg, ensuring they radiated a consistent, nurturing warmth to aid the tiny life within its stony prison. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, a tiny drumbeat of imminent arrival. The stakes were now higher than ever. This was no longer about hiding a secret, but about managing a moment that would echo through the history of her house. She took a slow, steadying breath, burying her personal triumph deep beneath a mask of professional duty. Then she turned, her voice carefully calibrated to blend concern with surprise, and called out to the senior keeper on duty across the chamber. "You might want to see this," she said, her gaze fixed on the egg as the hairline crack began to spiderweb, a promise of wonder about to be born. A sharp crack echoed in the warm chamber, and the emerald and bronze shell fell away in two perfect halves. From the fragments emerged a creature of impossible delicacy and vibrant life. Its scales were a brilliant, wet crimson, gleaming like freshly spilled blood in the firelight, and its wings were fragile membranes of translucent skin stretched over slender bones. It shook itself, sending tiny shards of shell skittering across the stone, and then its head, too large for its slender neck, lifted. Its eyes, a luminous and intelligent amber, found Lyra's face and locked onto her gaze with an unblinking intensity. There was no hesitation. It let out a soft, chirping cry and stumbled forward on unsteady legs, nudging its warm, smooth head insistently against her waiting hand. The bond, first forged in the Spire's heart, was now sealed in the open for all to witness. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered keepers, their astonishment a palpable force in the humid air. Murmurs began to swirl, questions about the egg's sudden appearance and its impossible lineage bubbling to the surface. Where did this one come from? I have no record of a crimson clutch this season. That is no common dragon. Lyra did not flinch. She met the dragonette's gaze and slowly, deliberately, ran a finger along the soft, leathery skin of its neck. In that single, public gesture, she claimed it. She accepted the weight of the stares and the whispers, the responsibility and the scrutiny, as the price for this miracle. Her secret was no longer entirely her own, and the political landscape of the hatchery had just shifted beneath their feet, as she offered the tiny dragonette its first piece of shredded meat. From a silver bowl, a familiar, quiet presence materialized at her side. The head archivist stood there, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He watched the crimson dragonette eat from her palm, and a slow, knowing look dawned on his aged face. A look that said her secret, while safe with him for now, had just become infinitely more complicated to keep. The head archivist's chambers smelled of dried herbs and old leather, a stark contrast to the humid heat of the hatchery. He did not speak at first, his gaze fixed on Lyra as she stood before his cluttered desk. "I knew you were searching for something more than old feeding charts," he said, his voice low and even. "I watched you in the library, your eyes tracing those forgotten lineages. I suspected a quest." He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning softly. "I could have stopped you, reported you to the High Keepers, but something in your determination, the fire I saw there, told me to wait. Your success with the Crimson Dragonette is not a transgression in my eyes. It is a renewal. It is the promise our house has been waiting for." Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment of truth, a precipice far more dangerous than any chasm. To lie now would be to build her future on a foundation of sand, forever looking over her shoulder. But to tell him everything, to speak of the whispering stone and the sentient mountain, was to hand him the power to shatter her newfound purpose entirely. She looked at his aged, knowing face and made her choice. With a slow, deliberate breath, she began to speak. She told him of the hum that called only to her, of the obsidian shard and the visions it granted. She described the crystalline bridge, the sentient whispers in the spire, and the final, magical barrier she had crossed not with force, but with intent. As she spoke, she drew the warm, dark stone from its hiding place and laid it on the desk between them. It pulsed once with a soft, golden light, as if in greeting. The archivist did not move, his expression unreadable. He had offered her a path to mentorship, to protection, but this confession, this proof of ancient magic, could still be judged as a dangerous aberration. The risk of a formal reprimand, of being stripped of her duties and separated from the dragonette, was still very real. She had laid her entire journey bare, and now she waited for his judgment. For a long moment, he was silent, his eyes fixed on the stone. Then, a slow, rare smile touched his lips, transforming his severe features. "It seems the mountain shared a secret with you," he said softly. "And it chose well. We shall study this together." He reached out a single, careful finger, not to take the stone, but to hover just above its shimmering surface. "There are greater mysteries here than a single lost egg, I think, far greater." The crimson dragonet, now named Ember for the fiery spirit, glowing in its amber eyes, became the new rhythm of Lyra's life. Her days were no longer a simple sequence of chores, but a delicate dance between her public duties and her private charge. She would rise before dawn to tend the other hatchlings, her hands sure and gentle as she checked their scales and filled their feeding troughs. But her attention always drifted back to the secluded corner where Ember waited, its small, warm body vibrating with a soft, chirping purr the moment it sensed her approach. The other keepers watched her with a new, quiet respect, their former casual camaraderie now tinged with a subtle deference. They saw the bond, a thing of clear and potent magic, and they recognized it as a sign of the house's favor. The head keeper himself began assigning her more complex tasks, overseeing the health of an entire clutch of newly laid eggs and mentoring the youngest apprentices. This new status was a shield, granting her authority and a measure of autonomy, but it was also a gilded cage, placing her constantly in the public eye. Every moment spent in the open was a performance, a careful act of normalcy that concealed the profound secret humming just beneath the surface. She learned to partition her mind, to discuss feeding schedules with one part of her brain, while another part turned over the cryptic whispers of the Spire and the warm, impossible weight of the obsidian shard she kept hidden in her quarters. Her decision was a conscious one, a vow made each morning. She would be the perfect dragon keeper, unimpeachable in her duties, and in the shadows, she would be a seeker, a guardian of the truths the mountain had entrusted to her. This dual life required a constant, exhausting vigilance, a careful calibration of every word and glance, but it also placed her in a unique position, a bridge between the practical world of fire and scale and the lost world of ancient song and stone. In the deep quiet of the evenings, when the hatchery was bathed in the soft, pulsing glow of the thermal vents, she found her sanctuary. She would settle onto a warm stone bench, and Ember would curl contentedly into her lap, a living, breathing weight of warmth. With one hand resting on the dragonet's slowly rising and falling side, she would unroll one of the fragile scrolls the archivist had discreetly provided. Her fingers would trace the faded Valyrian glyphs, not as a scholar, but as a listener, hoping to find an echo of the mountain's voice in the silent words of the long dead. The secluded courtyard was a pocket of quiet sunlight, a world away from the hatchery's constant hum. Here, Lyra and the dragon she now called Pyrales practiced the first, tentative steps of their partnership. The goal was simple, a command to lift a single, scaled foreleg. Pyrales chirped, its amber eyes fixed on her face, its entire body quivering with the effort to understand. The connection between them was no longer a silent thread, but a channel slowly opening. Lyra did not shout the command, she did not gesture. Instead, she closed her eyes and focused, pouring all her will into a single, clear image of the action she desired. In her mind, She saw the leg lifting, the clawed foot settling back down. For a long moment, there was only the warmth of the sun and the dragon's soft, questioning trill. Then, a flicker of understanding, a foreign sensation of muscle and joint moving, echoed back to her from Piralis's mind. The leg lifted, unsteady but deliberate. It was a victory measured in inches, but it felt like conquering a mountain. These exercises were a delicate dance, where every misstep carried real weight. A moment of frustration from Lyra, a sharp mental push born of impatience, could send the young dragon recoiling, its mind shuddering, closed like a frightened clam. The bond was as fragile as the translucent skin of its wings, and a fracture now could take months to heal, if it ever did. The physical danger was just as real. A startled Piralis, not yet in control of its own growing strength, could easily knock her from her feet with an ungainly wing flap or a panicked turn. Lyra learned to lead not with the force of her will, but with the quiet strength of her empathy. She learned to read the subtle shifts in Piralis's emotions. The flicker of confusion that meant a command was unclear, the spark of playful defiance that meant it was time for a break. She learned that true partnership was not about mastery, but about listening. The stakes of their success stretched far beyond the courtyard walls. A dragon and rider, bonded so deeply, were more than just a team. They were a living symbol of their house's strength, and a formidable asset in a world where power was often measured in fire and scale. Their failure would not be a private disappointment, but a public setback, a whisper that the lost lineage was perhaps too wild, too untamed to be trusted. One afternoon, after days of patient work, Lyra decided to test their progress with a more complex sequence. She sent a series of 3 simple images, one after the other, a mental map of a path she wanted Piralis to walk. The young dragon hesitated, its head cocked, processing the flood of information. Then, with a grace that surprised them both, it began to move, placing its feet precisely where her mind had directed, completing the pattern perfectly. A surge of pure, unadulterated pride washed through Lyra, so powerful and bright that Piralis lifted its head and echoed the feeling back to her with a happy, rumbling chirp. In that moment, looking at the magnificent creature she had helped bring into the world, Lyra allowed herself to glimpse a future woven from more than just duty and secrets, a future they would build together, one shared thought at a time. The new apprentice's hands trembled as she reached toward a skittish hatchling, her uncertainty a tangible force in the warm air. Lyra watched, a silent understanding settling in her chest. This was no longer just about her own journey or her bond with Piralis. The head keeper's decision to place young Alara in her care was a quiet testament to the new respect she commanded, and it carried a weight as profound as any mountain. She stepped forward, her voice calm and low. "Do not reach for its head," she instructed gently. "Let it come to your scent first. Your fear is a language it understands perfectly." She guided Alara's hand to rest, palm up, near the hatchling's claws, a gesture of offering, not demand. The lesson was about more than technique. It was about philosophy. A dragon is not a tool to be mastered, Lyra explained as the hatchling eventually nudged the girl's fingers with a curious snort. It is a partner born of fire and time. To work with one, you must first learn to listen. In these moments, she carefully curated the wisdom she shared. She spoke of the importance of patience, of reading the subtle shifts in a dragon's mood, of trusting one's own instincts in the deep, dark places of the world. But she veiled the true source of her knowledge. There were no stories of sentient whispers or crystalline bridges, no mention of the obsidian shard hidden in her quarters. To speak of those things would not inspire the girl. It would place a target upon her back, tempting her toward dangers Lyra herself had barely survived. She spoke instead of respecting the past, of the legacy left in fossilized scales and forgotten scrolls, teaching Lyra that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward with care and reverence. The future of their house, its traditions and its hidden knowledge, now depended on this delicate transfer of understanding. One day, as Lyra successfully soothed the once skittish hatchling into a rumbling, contented sleep, Lyra felt a deep, resonant shift. She was no longer just a keeper or a seeker. She was a link in a chain stretching back generations. Watching the girl's proud, quiet smile, she felt the comforting, powerful rhythm of their legacy continuing, a silent promise that the whispers of history would never truly fall silent. The deep, familiar tremor was different this time. It was not the mountain settling into its sleep, but a sharp, grinding shudder that rattled the very foundations of the hatchery. A moment later, a deafening roar tore through the air, a sound of pure, elemental fury. From the high observation slit, a terrifying glow painted the night sky an angry, violent red. The volcano was no longer dormant. Panic erupted among the keepers, their orderly world dissolving into chaos as the first hail of hot ash and pumice began to rain down upon the great stone roofs. The head keeper's voice cut through the din, shouting orders to secure the main gates, but his face was pale with a dread they all shared. The primary evacuation routes, the wide roads leading down the mountainside, were now rivers of fire, choked with falling debris and superheated gas. They were trapped. Lyra's mind, however, did not freeze with fear. It became a map, illuminated by memory, the forgotten drainage tunnel, the hidden goat trails, the network of lava tubes she had navigated in solitude. They were no longer paths to a secret, but a labyrinth of salvation. She pushed her way to the head keeper's side, her voice steady despite the tremors shaking the floor. "I know a way out," she said, her words cutting through the panic. "We can take the eggs and the youngest dragons through the mountain's heart." He stared at her, the impossibility of the statement warring with the certain death waiting at the gates. He saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, the deep, unshakable knowledge she should not possess, and he gave a single, sharp nod. The survival of their legacy now depended on the secrets she had nearly died to uncover. She moved with a purpose that galvanized the others, directing them to gather the most precious eggs into padded slings, and herd the confused, terrified hatchlings. Then she sent a single, clear thought to Pyrales, an image of the dark, safe tunnels, and a feeling of calm, steadfast leadership. The crimson dragon, now grown strong and sure, understood instantly. It took to the air within the vast chamber, not with panic, but with a commanding presence, its deep, resonant chirps and soothing mental presence flowing over the other dragons, stilling their instinctual fear. With Pyrales as their guide and guardian, the frantic creatures fell into a tense, manageable line. Lyra led the desperate procession into the dark, damp mouth of the drainage tunnel, the very path that had once been her final, claustrophobic test. Now it was an artery of hope. She called out landmarks from her memory, her voice a calm beacon in the oppressive darkness. Watch your step here. The floor drops away to the left. Keep the eggs level through this section. The ceiling is low. Her intimate knowledge of every turn, every unstable patch of rock, turned a potential death march into an orderly, if terrifying, retreat. Behind her, the other keepers followed, their trust in her forged in the heat of this cataclysm. They could hear the mountain tearing itself apart above them, the roars and crashes muffled by tons of stone, a constant reminder of the doom they were escaping. They emerged at last into the sheltered grove at the mountain's base, the very place where Lyra had once rested and tended to a single, secret egg. Now, it became a refuge for dozens of dragons and the exhausted, soot-streaked keepers who carried the future of their house in their arms. As they watched the fiery annihilation of their home from a safe distance, a profound silence fell over the group. They had not just escaped, they had been saved by one of their own, a keeper who had learned the mountain's language when no one else was listening. In that moment, Lyra was no longer just the girl with a mysterious bond. She was the guardian who had walked the deep places and returned with the knowledge to shepherd their very soul through the fire. The new hatchery breathed with the quiet rhythm of a world reborn. Nestled in a sheltered valley far from the mountain's fury, its walls were woven from living willow and strong, young stone. Lyra stood at its edge, the scent of damp earth and new growth filling the air as the sun dipped behind the distant, quiet peak. Pyrales rested on her shoulder, a warm and familiar weight, the dragon's crimson scales catching the last of the fading light in a soft, fiery gleam. The frantic terror of the eruption had settled into a profound, steady calm. She was no longer the novice who had trembled at the sound of a humming stone, but a leader whose word was sought on everything from nesting sites to the interpretation of old scrolls. The keepers looked to her not just for commands, but for wisdom, recognizing in her the deep, hard-won knowledge of the world's hidden heart. On a simple wooden shelf in her new quarters, the whispering obsidian shard rested in a place of honor. It no longer pulsed with an urgent call, but emitted a soft, constant glow, a quiet companion to her thoughts. It was a reminder that the greatest secrets are not always meant to stay lost, but are waiting for those with the courage to listen and the strength to protect what they find. The legacy of the dragons, once balanced on the edge of a volcano's wrath, was now secure, its future unfolding in the gentle sounds of hatchlings chirping in the twilight. A new chapter for her house was beginning, one woven not from fire and fear, but from the promise of discovery and the enduring, gentle hum of magic that had first called to her soul, now a comforting and permanent part of her life's melody. you.